My sister called me, 35 and still single, at a family dinner in San Antonio, Texas, in the specific, sing-song tone she'd perfected over years of similar comments. And my mother laughed, genuinely laughed, the kind of easy, delighted laugh that told me this wasn't the first time the two of them had shared this particular joke without me in the room. My name is Marisol Devereaux, 35 years old, and I want to explain something before I describe what I actually said in response, because I think the specific context matters considerably to understanding why that moment landed as more than just an ordinary sibling jab I could easily brush off. I had spent the previous 12 years building a genuinely fulfilling life on my own terms. A career in structural engineering I'd worked incredibly hard for, a home I owned outright after years of careful saving, close friendships, and a rich personal life that had nothing missing from it that I'd ever actually felt the absence of. My singleness wasn't a wound I was quietly nursing, whatever my family seemed to consistently assume about it. My sister Colette, 32, had married her husband Trevor 6 years earlier, and our family had spent every gathering since treating that marriage as the definitive proof of her successful, complete adult life. A framing I'd absorbed for years without ever fully examining how much it actually rested on assumption rather than genuine, close attention to how Colette and Trevor's life together was actually going. I want to describe the specific moment carefully, because I think it matters to understanding exactly what happened next. I set my drink down on the table, deliberately, and looked directly at both my mother and my sister. "I want to ask you both something," I said, keeping my voice level despite the years of accumulated frustration finally surfacing. "Being 35 and single means I've built an entire life that nobody had to fund, fix, or rescue me from. Can either of you actually say the same thing about your own situations right now?" I want to be honest about the specific, uncomfortable silence that followed, understanding that my question wasn't actually rhetorical, and watching both my mother and Colette's faces shift as they apparently understood that too. I want to explain what I was actually referencing, because I think it matters considerably to understanding why that question landed as pointedly as it did. I had learned, roughly 4 months earlier, from an accidental slip during a phone call with my mother, that she had been quietly helping Colette and Trevor cover their mortgage payments for nearly a year, a fact neither of them had ever directly shared with me, despite the family's consistent, ongoing narrative treating Colette's marriage as an obvious, unquestionable success story compared to my own supposedly incomplete single life. I also want to be honest about something I'd never directly discussed with my mother, though I'd understood it, in general terms, for most of my adult life. My parents' own marriage, before my father's death 8 years earlier, had been considerably more strained than the version of their relationship my mother typically presented to extended family and friends. A strain rooted in financial stress, and according to conversations I'd had with my father directly in his final years, a marriage he described to me privately as something he'd stayed in primarily out of obligation and fear of judgment, rather than genuine ongoing happiness. I want to describe my mother's reaction to my question carefully, because I think it reveals something considerably more complicated than simple embarrassment. She sat quietly for a long moment before responding, her voice considerably smaller than the confident, laughing tone she'd used just minutes earlier. "That's not fair, Marisol," she said. "Helping Colette with her mortgage isn't the same as her marriage being some kind of failure." "Never said it was a failure," I said. "I said I've built financial independence entirely on my own, and I asked if either of you could say the same right now. You just confirmed you're currently helping fund Colette's household. That's simply a fact, not an attack." I want to describe what happened over the following several minutes, because I think it matters considerably more than the initial confrontation itself. Colette, visibly uncomfortable, finally spoke, her voice carrying a rawness I rarely heard from her. "Things have actually been really hard with Trevor and me," she admitted. "His job situation changed pretty significantly last year, and we've been struggling considerably more than either of us has really talked about with the family. I think it's been easier to just let everyone keep believing everything's fine than to actually explain how difficult it's genuinely been. I want to be honest about the complicated mixture of vindication and genuine, unexpected compassion I felt hearing that admission, understanding that my sister had apparently been carrying real financial stress and marital strain privately. behind a carefully maintained public narrative our entire family had simply accepted without question, specifically because that narrative fit our family's broader, unexamined assumption that marriage automatically represented success, while my own single life automatically represented something incomplete. I want to describe the conversation my mother and I eventually had, later that same evening, once Colette had left and the two of us were alone in the kitchen, because I think it matters considerably to understanding how this entire situation actually resolved. I think I've spent years measuring both of you against a very narrow idea of what a successful life is supposed to look like, my mother said, her voice carrying a genuine, difficult honesty I hadn't expected from her. I think some of that comes from my own marriage to your father, if I'm being honest with myself. We weren't happy for a long time before he died, Marisol, and I think some part of me needed to believe that Colette's marriage represented something better, something I could point to as proof that things could actually work out the way I'd always hoped they would for both of you. I want to describe what happened over the following months, because I think it matters considerably more than that single, difficult conversation. My mother began, in small but genuine ways, examining the specific language and assumptions she'd carried for years about marriage and success, catching herself, on more than one occasion during subsequent family gatherings, before making a comment that would have, previously, gone entirely unexamined. Colette and Trevor, once their financial and relationship difficulties were finally out in the open, rather than quietly hidden behind a carefully maintained public narrative, began working with a financial counselor and, separately, a couples therapist. A process Colette described to me, in the honest conversations we've slowly built since that dinner, as genuinely difficult but ultimately clarifying for both of them. I want to be honest about something important here, because I think it matters to understanding how this story actually concludes. I don't think singleness is inherently superior to marriage, and I want to be clear that wasn't the actual point I was making at that dinner table. What I was actually trying to name, in that specific moment, was the unfairness of my family's automatic assumption that marital status alone determined whose life was actually working, an assumption that had allowed genuine struggle to remain hidden simply because it didn't fit a comfortable, expected narrative, while my own genuine, hard-won stability had been consistently dismissed simply because it didn't come wrapped in a wedding ring. I want to tell you about a conversation I had with Colette roughly 6 months after that original dinner, because I think it captures something meaningful about how our relationship has genuinely changed since then. I think I resented you a little before all of this, she told me. Not because your life was actually worse than mine, but because I think some part of me needed everyone to believe my life was the successful one, especially once things started getting hard with Trevor. It was easier to make jokes about your singleness than to actually admit how much I was struggling behind the scenes. I think, often, about that dinner table moment, about setting my drink down and asking a simple, direct question that neither my mother nor my sister had apparently ever expected me to actually ask out loud. I don't think that question was cruel, though I understand it landed as uncomfortable in the moment. I think it was, finally, an honest invitation for my family to examine an assumption we'd all been quietly operating under for years, one that had cost my sister considerable unnecessary isolation during a genuinely difficult period of her own life, simply because admitting struggle didn't fit the story our family preferred to tell about what a successful adult life was supposed to look like. I am still single, considerably content with the life I've built, and my family, I think, finally understands that my independence was never actually the problem they'd spent years quietly, casually implying it was.